Somewhere on your feed right now, there's probably a headline telling you that footprints found on a beach in Namibia just proved humans walked there 130,000 years ago. It's a genuinely great headline. There's just one problem with it. No verified footprint site of that age has actually been reported from Namibia. Not in any peer-reviewed journal, not from any of the research teams who specialize in exactly this kind of discovery, not anywhere in the published scientific record as it currently stands. What has been found and thoroughly, rigorously verified sits just a little further down the same stretch of African coastline in South Africa, and the real story is honestly even stranger and more moving than the invented one, because it isn't just about proving humans were somewhere at some point. It's about catching individual, specific human beings, by name in every sense except the literal one, in the exact motion of walking, running, and once, almost unbearably, carrying a child, frozen in stone for over 100,000 years. So let's walk through what's actually been found. Because the true story of ancient footprints along this coast doesn't need a single invented detail to be one of the most quietly astonishing chapters in all of paleoanthropology. Start with why a footprint is such a strange and special thing to find in the first place, stranger, in a lot of ways, than a fossilized bone. A skeleton tells you an enormous amount about a person's biology, their age, their diet, sometimes even their cause of death. But a skeleton is static. It's the end state of a life, not a moment inside it. A footprint is something else entirely. It's a direct, physical record of a single, fleeting action. A foot pressing into wet sand on one particular afternoon, tens of thousands of years ago, captured mid-motion and then, through an almost absurd stroke of geological luck, preserved rather than erased by the next wave. Researchers who study these tracks, a field formerly called ichnology, have pointed out that a well-preserved trackway can reveal a person's height, their approximate weight, their walking speed, sometimes even whether they were limping, running, or carrying a burden, information no bone, no matter how complete, can ever fully provide on its own. Think about what an ordinary walk to the shoreline actually involves: the shifting weight, the slight stagger over an unexpected patch of soft sand, the small pause to look at something in the water, and then imagine every one of those tiny, unconscious decisions somehow surviving intact, printed into the ground and then sealed there by pure geological accident, for longer than our entire species has had written language. That's essentially what these sites are, an archive of pure, unscripted human behavior, with nothing performed or curated about it, because the person leaving the print had absolutely no idea anyone would ever see it again. And that's exactly what makes them so rare in the fossil record. For a footprint to survive at all, the surface it was pressed into has to be firm enough to hold a clear impression, then covered gently enough by later sediment that it doesn't wash away, then, over time, chemically hardened into stone strongly enough to survive erosion, and then, after all of that, it has to actually be found, often by pure chance, by someone in the right place at the right moment before the next storm or the next high tide destroys it completely. For most of the 20th century, sites like this were considered almost freakishly uncommon anywhere in the world older than about 50,000 years. As recently as the early 2000s, researchers working across the entire African continent could point to only 4 confirmed hominin. Trackway sites older than that threshold, 2 in East Africa, at Latoli in Tanzania and Kubifora in Kenya, both far older and associated with earlier hominin species rather than modern humans, and 2 in South Africa, at Nahoon and Langaban, the very first hominin trackway ever formally described anywhere on Earth, having been reported at Nahoon back in 1966. That was essentially the entire global tally for decades. Then something changed, not because footprints suddenly started appearing that hadn't existed before, but because a small, dedicated group of researchers finally started looking properly, in the right kind of terrain, with the right kind of patience. Today, the confirmed count of dated hominin ichnocytes older than 50,000 years across Africa stands at 14, split between a cluster in East Africa and a much larger, remarkably concentrated cluster of 9 separate sites strung along the Cape south coast of South Africa, a stretch of ancient dune and lagoon geology that has turned out to be one of the single richest footprint records left behind by early Homo sapiens anywhere on the planet. The most famous of these sites has a name almost as evocative as the science behind it. In 1995, a geologist named David Roberts was surveying the shoreline near Langaban Lagoon on South Africa's west coast when he spotted something in a slab of cemented dune sand. 3 clear impressions: a heel strike, the ball of a foot, the unmistakable spread of toes. Careful analysis dated the surrounding sediment to approximately 117,000 years old, and the size and shape of the prints strongly suggested they belonged to an adult woman. Researchers nicknamed the find Eve's footprint, And for years, it held the title of the oldest confirmed footprint of an anatomically modern human ever discovered anywhere on Earth. There's a genuinely striking coincidence buried in that number, too, worth mentioning honestly as the interesting curiosity it is, rather than overstating it as proof of anything specific. 117,000 years ago sits comfortably within the broad range that geneticists, working from an entirely separate line of evidence, mitochondrial DNA passed down the maternal line, have calculated for when the most recent common ancestor of every living human female lineage, the population geneticists nicknamed mitochondrial Eve, likely lived in Africa. The footprint and the genetic estimate aren't proof of the same specific individual. That's not how either kind of science works. But the fact that a physical footprint from an adult woman and the deep genetic clock both point independently toward roughly the same window of deep human history is exactly the kind of quiet, cross-disciplinary confirmation that makes this field so compelling. Alongside the footprint itself, researchers working the same stretch of coastline found associated stone tools, a worked core, several scraper blades, cutting implements, and even a shaped spear point, all consistent with the same time period. They also found traces of ochre, the reddish iron oxide pigment that shows up again and again at early modern human sites across southern Africa, used for symbolic decoration, for tanning hides, and quite possibly, researchers have speculated, for body paint. It's led to a genuinely evocative, if admittedly unprovable, possibility that the woman who left that single footprint might have been wearing ochre pigment on her skin at the exact moment she crossed that stretch of wet sand, a small, deeply human detail reaching across more than 100,000 years. Eve's footprint held its record for decades, until 2023, and when a team led by geologist Charles Helm of Nelson Mandela University, working the same broader Cape South Coast region within what's now Garden Route National Park, formally confirmed an even older set of tracks, dated to approximately 153,000 years, making them, as of right now, the single oldest confirmed footprints of Homo sapiens ever discovered anywhere on Earth, predating Eve's footprint by roughly 36,000 years. This wasn't a lucky, isolated find either. It fit directly into that broader pattern the same research team had been slowly building for close to 2 decades, patiently surveying the same rugged coastline, spotting faint impressions in ancient cemented dune, surfaces that most people would walk straight past without a second glance, then subjecting each candidate site to careful geological dating before confirming or ruling it out. The dating method behind all of these confirmations deserves its own explanation, because it's genuinely elegant, and it's the same core technique that's been used to verify essentially every major footprint discovery of this kind in recent years, including the real Moroccan and Saudi Arabian sites we'll get to shortly. It's called optically stimulated luminescence dating, and it works by measuring a property of quartz and feldspar grains buried in sediment. These minerals slowly accumulate a tiny amount of stored energy from background radiation in the surrounding soil over time, energy that gets reset to zero, essentially rebooted, whenever the grains are exposed directly to sunlight. Once buried again, that energy starts accumulating afresh. By carefully extracting a sample without exposing it to light in the field, researchers typically hammer a sealed, opaque metal tube directly into the target sediment layer, under a dark cloth or at night, so that the grains inside never see daylight again before they reach the laboratory, and then measuring, under controlled laboratory conditions, precisely how much light-sensitive energy has built back up inside the grains. Researchers can calculate exactly how long that sediment layer has sat undisturbed and light-free since it was last exposed to the sun. In other words, since it was buried, which, for a footprint, pressed into sand and then covered by the next layer of dune deposit, tells you almost exactly how long ago that footprint was made. The technique isn't perfect. It typically carries a margin of error of several thousand years in either direction, and researchers generally date several independent samples from both above and below the footprint layer to cross-check the results before publishing anything, which is exactly why these dates take years of careful fieldwork to confirm, rather than being announced the moment a print is first spotted. It's a technique built on genuinely clever physics, rather than guesswork, and it's the reason researchers can state these dates with the kind of confidence that lets a 153,000-year-old footprint hold up under serious international scientific scrutiny. This entire South African coastal footprint record matters for a much bigger reason than any single trackway on its own, because it lines up almost perfectly with genetic and fossil evidence pointing towards southern Africa as one of the true cradles of our species. The oldest confirmed Homo sapiens fossils, from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, redated in 2017 to roughly 300,000 years, push the deep origin of our species back further than most people realize, and separate genetic research on populations like the San and other Khoisan groups of southern Africa has repeatedly found some of the oldest, most deeply diverged human genetic lineages anywhere on the planet, populations whose ancestors split off from the rest of humanity's family tree somewhere in the range of 100 to 150,000 years ago. The footprints along the Cape Coast sit right inside that same broad window, physical, walkable, literally step-by-step confirmation that this region wasn't just where our species originated in some abstract genetic sense, it's where actual individual people were living, walking and raising children on these exact beaches, in numbers substantial enough that we keep finding more evidence of them every time researchers look carefully enough. The story doesn't stop at the South African coast either, and setting it beside two other genuinely real, recently confirmed footprint discoveries elsewhere in the world helps show just how much this entire field has exploded over the past few years. In 2022, researchers examining boulders on a small pocket beach near Larache on Morocco's Atlantic coast stumbled onto something that would turn out to be the oldest confirmed hominin footprint site anywhere in North Africa or the wider Mediterranean region. Led by Monsef Sidrati of the University of Bretagne Sud, working with an international team, they eventually mapped 85 individual footprints spread across two separate trackways covering nearly 3,000 square meters of ancient hardened beach surface. Using the same optically stimulated luminescence method, they dated the site to approximately 90,000 years old, and the range of footprint sizes across the two trails suggested something genuinely touching. Several individuals of clearly different ages, adults and children together, moving across the same beach as what researchers described as likely a multi-generational family group, walking toward and away from the water on what may have been an entirely ordinary afternoon, 90,000 years before anyone would ever read about it. Further east, along what's now the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, researchers examining the shores of an ancient, long-vanished lake in Saudi Arabia found 7 human footprints, dated to somewhere between roughly 112 and 121,000 years ago, published in the journal Science Advances by a team including Matthew Stewart and Michael Petralia. What makes this particular site so significant isn't just its age, it's its location. Because during that specific window of Earth's climate history, the region that's now the harsh, arid interior of Saudi Arabia experienced a genuinely wetter, greener period, with lakes, grasslands, and wildlife including elephants and hippos, whose own footprints were found crossing the exact same ancient lakeshore surface. That detail turns this single trackway into a real physical marker along one of the plausible routes early modern humans took as they expanded out of Africa and into the rest of Eurasia, a green corridor across what's now desert, walkable for a window of time before the climate shifted back and closed it off again. And the story keeps stretching, remarkably, all the way to the Americas. At White Sands National Park in New Mexico, researchers, led by Matthew Bennett, identified an extensive set of human trackways preserved in what was once the muddy margin of an ancient lake, and after years of careful, occasionally contested dating work involving the seeds of an aquatic plant called ditch grass, found layered directly above and below the footprint horizons. The site was confirmed to date to somewhere between roughly 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That places these tracks solidly within the depths of the last ice age, and if the dating holds up under continued scrutiny, and much of the archaeological community has increasingly come to accept that it does, it makes White Sands some of the clearest, most direct physical evidence that humans had already reached North America well before the long-favored, more conservative timeline most textbooks taught for decades. Put every one of these real, independently verified sites together, South Africa's Cape Coast, holding both the current record for oldest confirmed Homo sapiens footprint at 153,000 years and the earlier, evocatively named Eve's footprint at 117,000 years, Morocco's 90,000-year-old family. Trackway on the Atlantic coast, Saudi Arabia's 112 to 121,000-year-old lakeshore crossing, marking a genuine migration corridor, and White Sands' 21 to 23,000-year-old confirmation of an early human presence in the Americas, and you get something genuinely remarkable. A real physical, walkable trail of evidence tracing the actual footsteps of our species' expansion across 4 continents, verified not through speculation, but through careful, repeatable geological dating, published in serious peer-reviewed journals and openly, transparently explained by the researchers who found them. There's one more genuinely fascinating wrinkle from this same stretch of South African coastline worth including because it adds a layer of behavioral detail that goes beyond simply proving people were there. Among the more than 350 vertebrate tracks researchers have documented along the Cape South coast over the past 15 years, the vast majority clearly barefoot, complete with distinct toe impressions pressed into the sand. A smaller number show something different, elongated, evenly shaped depressions with no toe marks at all. Researcher Charles Helm and colleagues, publishing their analysis in the journal Ichnos, proposed that at least some of these unusual tracks, found at sites dated to somewhere between roughly 70,000 and possibly more than 130,000 years old, might represent among the earliest suggestive evidence anywhere on Earth of ancient humans wearing some form of primitive footwear, quite possibly hide or leather wrappings meant to protect feet from the sharp, rocky sections of coastline or from extremes of heat and cold. Helm has been appropriately careful about how far to take that claim, noting directly that the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, and that the track record may simply be biased toward preserving barefoot impressions more clearly than shod ones. But if that interpretation holds up under further scrutiny, it would push the origins of human footwear back dramatically earlier than the oldest confirmed physical shoe remains, tantalizing evidence, printed directly into ancient sand that early southern African populations may have already been solving. The very practical problem of walking comfortably across a genuinely harsh, rocky coastline tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to look for it. Which brings us back to Namibia specifically, and to being honest about what hasn't actually been found there yet, because it matters for understanding where this field genuinely stands right now. Namibia does hold genuinely significant, well-documented archaeological sites of its own, including the Apollo 11 cave in the country's south, home to some of the oldest confirmed rock art on the African continent, painted stone slabs dated to roughly 27,000 years ago, but as of right now, no peer-reviewed, dated hominin footprint site anywhere near 130,000. Years Old has been published from anywhere along the Namibian coast. The number itself doesn't match any confirmed site anywhere in the world either, sitting in an odd gap between Eve's footprint at 117,000 years and the garden route record at 153,000, suggesting it may simply be a rounded, garbled version of one of those two. Genuine South African discoveries, relocated to a neighboring country by the time it finished traveling through several rounds of online repetition. The correction doesn't make this a disappointing story, though. It arguably makes it a more interesting one, because it means the search is still genuinely actively open. Researchers working the South African coast didn't find 14 sites by accident or in a single lucky season. They found them by returning to the same difficult, wave-battered stretch of shoreline year after year, developing a trained eye for exactly what a 100,000-year-old footprint looks like once it's been cemented into rock and partially eroded, weathered, and half buried again by a century of shifting sand. That same expertise and that same patient methodology is entirely transferable to Namibia's coastline and to plenty of other stretches of African and Arabian shoreline. Nobody has systematically surveyed yet if a 153,000-year-old footprint could sit essentially in plain sight along a well-visited stretch of South African coast for tens of thousands of years before anyone with the right training happened to walk past it and recognize what they were looking at. It's entirely reasonable to expect that Namibia, or Angola, or countless other unstudied coastlines around the world are holding their own version of that exact same discovery, simply waiting for the right person to look closely enough at the right tide on the right afternoon. There's something worth sitting with in all of this beyond just the raw dates and locations. A footprint, unlike almost anything else that survives from deep prehistory, isn't evidence of a population in the abstract. It's evidence of one specific person on one specific day, mid-stride, unaware that the next few seconds of an entirely ordinary walk across a beach would end up outlasting nearly every other trace of their existence by well over 100,000 years. Every other kind of archaeological evidence, tools, bones, pigment, tells you what people were capable of. A footprint tells you, with an intimacy nothing else in the fossil record quite matches, that they were simply, actually, there, walking, the way you walked to get your coffee this morning, on a beach that, geologically speaking, might not look all that different from the one under your own feet the next time you happen to stand on one. And that intimacy compounds when you start noticing the smaller details researchers have picked out across these sites. A shorter stride pattern beside a longer one suggesting a child hurrying to keep pace with an adult. A set of prints where the impressions on one side sink noticeably deeper than the other, hinting at someone carrying real weight, a bundle, a tool, possibly another person, slung against one hip. None of these details survive in a stone tool or a scattered collection of bones the way they survive in a trackway, because a trackway is the one piece of the archaeological record that was never meant to be evidence of anything at all. It's simply what was left over from somebody living an ordinary afternoon tens of thousands of years before the concept of being remembered would have meant anything to them. That's the real story hiding underneath the exaggerated Namibian headline. Not a single dramatic new discovery, but an entire Patiently assembled, continent-spanning record of real human footsteps. Verified one careful measurement at a time, still actively growing every single year, and very possibly, quite literally, still waiting to be found at the next time someone walks the right beach at the right moment and happens to look down.